Stenton's testimony today have been notified? Are any of them here?
No.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Good morning, Mr. Commissioner.
Sorry, we won't fall foul of any of our regulations, will we?
No, Mr.
Is there
Commissioner.
no time within which or before which they should be informed or
It's not
advised?
peremptory. They still have the opportunity to come and testify or to apply for cross-examination.
As long as you're sure we won't fall foul of the regulations.
I'm comfortable with that. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Yes, Ms. Kuwe.
Thank you, Commissioner. Good morning, Commissioner and members. As Senior Counsel has already said, Mr. Ian Stenton was present in the Commission yesterday when Mr. Roy Raja and Mr. Benedict Mongalo testified about the SA Home Loans transaction. Mr. Stenton has prepared a statement and he will be going through it right now. Mr. Stenton, am I correct that you have provided a statement without any coercion?
That is correct.
You may start at paragraph 1 of your statement. Thank you.
Thank you. In paragraph 1, I make the point that I'm employed by the Standard Bank of South Africa, that I was until June of last year the Group General Counsel responsible for the management of legal risk for the group throughout the globe. I reached the compulsory retirement age in June last year, and I was retained then as special counsel dealing with specific legal risk issues, and that's the role I play today. In paragraph 2, I confirm that I've been authorized to make the statement and to appear here. And in paragraph 3, I describe the circumstances under which I came to be giving this evidence, namely that I observed, I followed some of these proceedings last week when I heard it said that issues pertaining to SA home loans would be the subject matter of a particular session this week, and I inquired of the evidence leader as to when that would be, because Standard Bank owns 50% of SA home loans. We are also a substantial creditor of SA home loans, and we have entrusted billions of rands worth of our own home loan book to SA home loans to manage. So we have a real interest in what goes on at SA home loans. So I contacted the evidence leader and asked when this evidence would be led, and he informed it was for yesterday and invited me to be present. So I attended, and after I'd heard the evidence leader, he asked me if there's any information that I thought might be of interest to the commissioners but which hadn't been included in at least the oral part of what was presented. I clearly had no insight into the actual document, was anxious, but I did feel there was some information that could have been made available yesterday that wasn't, that I could be of assistance to this commission in its terms of reference, and I was asked by the evidence leader if I could reduce that to writing and appear here today, and that's why I'm here.
Morning. Mr. Stenton, just a question. The PIC has committed something like 9 billion to the company. What is the Standard Bank's commitment today?
We obviously have 50% shareholding. I would have to come back with the exact figures, but in terms of loan funding, it's about 3 billion rand, and in terms of assets under management, it's about 40 billion rand.
I was more looking at the Standard Bank contribution in terms of lending to the company.
I think in loans, I'll come back with the correct number, but it's between 3 and 4 billion rand.
4 billion rand.
Yes.
Okay.
In terms of the corporate structure, which you might well be familiar, SAHL Investment Holdings Proprietary Limited is an investment holding company, and its principal operating subsidiary is SA Home Loans Proprietary Limited. I'm sure you'll also be aware, SA Home Loans conducts business, as its name infers, in the home loan market in South Africa. It competes with all the banks under that brand, including obviously Standard Bank, but the way it raises funds in order to lend to the home loan market is to form sort of insolvency remote special purpose vehicles, which then issue commercial paper to the debt capital markets. The investors in those markets are typically asset managers, pension funds, provident funds, and the like, who want to invest in debt instruments. And so the SA Home Loans issues them with commercial paper, and the funds that raised through that mechanism are then on lent to buyers of homes to finance home purchases. I think we've owned our stake in SA Home Loans for more than 2 decades, I think. It's a highly successful business. It competes very well, and it's very well regarded both in the debt capital markets, i.e. investors have a lot of faith in the management and the way they do business, and it also, I think, is well regarded in the home loan sector. Its background, which I think is relevant to the Commission, is that in the period leading up to the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, SA Home Loans, and I'll use that for the group generically, had only 2 shareholders, being Standard Bank, one, and the other was JP Morgan. That's the American global bank that's headquartered in the United States. And when the financial crisis of 2008-2009 occurred, obviously investors in the debt capital markets withdrew, in a sense that they were reluctant to take on exposures because of the turmoil and uncertainty in the markets. And this created a predicament for SA Home Loans, because obviously commercial paper is issued for fixed terms, and as they mature, you have to then raise more money to replace the debt, as it were. So SA Home Loans was faced with the predicament of having reduced investor appetite for its commercial paper at a time when it was being forced to repay loans. It therefore turned to its shareholders at the time and asked us to assist with liquidity, just to ensure that it didn't default in any of its obligations. Standard Bank, and obviously there was an amount required, Standard Bank contributed its share, and JP Morgan declined to. JP Morgan's view was that globally they had found themselves in the financial crisis because of exposure to the domestic home loan market, and therefore they had no appetite whatsoever to increasing the exposure to that market, and therefore would not assist SA Home Loans. That forced us as Standard Bank to then take up their share of the assistance required. SA Home Loans obviously weathered the storm and emerged a stronger and better business, but we agreed with its management that it was unfortunate that JP Morgan had not been able to stand shoulder to shoulder with us in supporting the business, and we therefore jointly encouraged JP Morgan to look for a buyer for its shareholding in the business, who would be an institution willing and able to actually support us should such a crisis reoccur. And this led, as I understand it,
a question here. Just in terms of that liquidity support, did it mean that you bought some commercial paper, from them,
Yes, correct.
And how big was that support?
I don't have the figures, and I would be misleading if I guessed, but I can certainly get that information for you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right. Please do.
The management of SA Home Loans identified the government employees pension fund as a potential candidate to replace JP Morgan. And I was told that the CEO of SA Home Loans, together with JP Morgan, then commenced discussions about the GEPF acquiring an equity stake in the business. I obtained last night from SA Home Loans a copy of a presentation dated September 2012, which was the first sort of overtures by SA Home Loans to the GEPF through the PIC about them acquiring an equity stake in the business. These overtures resulted in JP Morgan agreeing to sell its 50% stake in SA Home Loans effectively to the GPF. That was the sort of in principle. As the negotiations progressed, the PIC introduced Mr. Kolofela Maponya as a buyer of half the stake that was being acquired from JP Morgan. And I've set that all out in paragraphs 8 and 9. In paragraph 10, I point out that...
Sorry,
Yes.
Mr. Stenton, if you don't have the information, perhaps we can obtain that through the team, the PIC team, but, I mean, the commission team. But who comprised the consortium that Mr. Maponya was the lead of? Do we know who that was? Because the names become Bolacha Hlogo Consortium, and the relation of BHC to MMI and who the consortium was of the different components would be useful. I don't know, Mr. Stenton, if you have that information.
Madam Commissioner, if you look at Annexure SP0, you'll find the MOI for the company. This MOI was amended at the time to allow for the transaction. And if you use the pages of the MOI and you page through to page 45, in fact, to page 46, you'll see there's a page headed Schedule 2 BHC Shareholders.
Okay.
And that was the information given to us at the time as to who the consortium members were through BHC.
Thank you. If the team could then look at that in terms of MMI and see what the comparison or the additional people may be, so we have an idea of who BHC is and who MMI is. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
coming back to paragraph 9, we heard yesterday that BCH had a concept document, or, they actually sort of talked to the PIC about this whole concept about the company. And this contradicts this, that actually the company went to the PIC first. Can you give us some light there, please?
Yes, I think the executives of SA Home Loans will be better positioned to give you actual details, but what they have, as I said, what they sent me was a presentation dated September 2012, in which SA Home Loans proposed to PIC that the GPF acquire an equity stake in SA Home Loans. And they told me last night, and they'd have to get confirmation, that was about a year before they were introduced to Mr. Maponya.
Yeah, thanks. So we need to just double check
Yes.
in terms of the dates, because that has got a bearing on the fee. Yes.
Correct. There was in place at the time a shareholders agreement between Standard Bank and JP Morgan, in terms of which Standard Bank had preemptive rights, i.e. if JP Morgan was to sell, then Standard Bank could buy the shares. So in effect, the consent of Standard Bank was required for any shares to be sold to Mr. Maponya and his consortium. Now, I make the point in paragraph 10 that Standard Bank was reluctant to give its consent to the consortium acquiring these shares because the very purpose of the sale was to introduce an institutional buyer with sufficient capital and liquidity to provide support to SA Home Loans in times of need, and Mr. Maponya and his consortium at face value would not satisfy that requirement. In order to procure Standard Bank's consent, it was then proposed to us that the GEPF would guarantee the obligations of Mr. Maponya and his consortium to provide funding to SA Home Loans in times of need. And as a result of that undertaking, the Standard Bank gave its consent to the transaction proceeding. The actual guarantee itself, it's a form of suretyship, is contained in the MOI, and I give the details there.
Question here. Would you know who actually recommended BCH to the company within the PIC? Would you know the person within the PIC who said you need to deal with Mr. Maponya, the company?
I don't know. I don't know who did that. I can say that on the first occasion I met Mr. Maponya was at a meeting in the offices of JP Morgan. This is at the stage when the negotiations were at an advanced stage and we were getting together to discuss contractual terms, etc. And in that meeting, I asked Mr. Maponya how it is that he, out of 52 million South Africans, came to be chosen to acquire this stake. And he said it was due to his relationship with Dr. Machila. But how he recommended him, I don't know.
Thank you.
So I then make the point in paragraph 12 that as a result of these factors which I've alluded to during 2014, the GPF, represented by the PIC1, purchased for itself 25% of the ordinary voting shares in SA Home Loans in issue, and 2 assisted the Balacha Hlogo Consortium Proprietary Limited IEBHC to acquire the other 25% was available. The GPF facilitated that by, as I understand it, lending money to the BHC against the security of the shares purchased, binding itself as guarantor for any future funding obligations owed by BHC to SA Home Loans, and securing a right of first refusal to purchase any of the purchased shares in SA Home Loans that BHC may wish to sell. I point out that guarantor obligations can be found in clause 35.5 of the MOI, and the right of first refusal in clause 36.2.1 of the MOI.
Sorry, just on that, would you be familiar at all whether such a guarantor would be standard practice from a third party like the PIC, which has its own 25% stake in it? Would that have been standard practice? And if for our commission team, can we try to obtain from the PIC how many deals have they stood guarantor for? What is the risk of those guarantees, and in what amounts? That in their support for a third party that they bring to a deal, to a transaction, do they have outstanding obligations, and have those been reflected or recorded in its financial statements or elsewhere as to contingent liabilities?
Madam Commissioner, may I say that we have in Standard Bank a corporate finance team that specializes in funding BE transactions. They'll be far better equipped than I to answer your question, so may I undertake to get a view from them as to what they've seen in the market, and I'll come back to you with a statement. In the next paragraph, I simply record that as a result of this transaction being concluded, BSC nominated Mr. Maponya and another to represent it as directors on the board of effectively SA Home Loans. The GPF, represented by the PIC, nominated Mr. Raja and Mr. Masakeza. And I point out there, in answer to the Madam Commissioner's earlier question, that the disclosure of who the shareholders were of BHC is as contained in the Schedule 2 to the MOI. The rationale that was given and agreed, I suppose, for the GPF acquiring this stake was a wish by the GPF to have an efficient vehicle through which it could make funding available to its members at competitive rates. That was the rationale for the transaction. So it's not surprising that once the transaction had been concluded, SA Home Loans approached the PIC and said, could they borrow funds for on lending to the GPF members as had always been envisaged. And that resulted in effectively a loan agreement there of where GPF agreed to advance up to 9 billion rand to SA home loans or special purpose vehicles established by it for that specific purpose.
Just a question there. So this 9 billion, was it part of those guarantees or guarantor issues, or it was just a separate matter?
No, it was completely separate. This was a straightforward commercial loan, not the provision of funding support in liquidity constrained circumstances. It was a term of that 9 billion rand loan that SA Home Loans paid to the GPF a commitment fee of 0.5% or 50 basis points, which obviously amounts to 45 million rand. After the loan agreement had been concluded, you'll see at paragraph 15 that Mr. Maponya then, on behalf of his company MMI, delivered to SA Home Loans an invoice for 59.8 million rand. I have attached a copy of that invoice to the papers. You'll find it as Annexure SB1, and it's dated 29 February 2016, and it's for a claims to be for a transaction origination fee of 52.5 million rand plus VAT, which gets to 59.85 million rand.
We seem not to have SB1, the invoice. We seem not to have that one.
Yeah, perhaps we could just have that tabled for us. It's not in our files.
We'll do that, Commissioner. My apologies.
Okay.
Ms. Maponya at the time justified this claim on the basis it was his alleged personal interventions at the PIC that had influenced the PIC's decision to grant the 9 billion rand facility. And for that he expected to be paid this amount of money. To my knowledge, SA Home Loans refused to recognize the liability or make the payment. For various reasons, I can give them to you. I'm not sure that they are relevant, but they're legal and technical. Legal in the sense that he had no mandate to represent the company. He wasn't asked to get involved. He wasn't involved. He didn't declare his interest in terms of Section 75 of the Companies Act when the loan was approved by the board, etc. And in essence, the fundamental issue was that SA Home Loans didn't think it was appropriate for a director of SA Home Loans who represents a shareholder in SA Home Loans to be paid a fee for being involved in any way in monies being borrowed by SA Home Loans. So they refused to pay him. And that then came to nothing after that.
I suppose those are issues that will be ventilated in court.
He's not suing for this amount of money. His cause of action here was services rendered for which he wanted to be paid. The litigation that he introduced is based upon a cession that he says the PIC implemented, which is something different. Having not secured payment from SA Home Loans for his alleged interventions at the PIC, as outlined, Mr. Maponya then procured the delivery to SA Home Loans of a letter, which is annexed here too, from the PIC to SA Home Loans. In it, the PIC purported to give notice that it had ceded to MMI a right which the GPF had to receive 45 million rand as a commitment fee from the borrowers, i.e. these special purpose vehicles, or SA Home Loans under the 9 billion rand loan facility.
Sorry, Mr. Stenton, could you indicate why you use the word purportedly?
Only because subsequently a letter was issued saying that it should never have been, there was in fact no valid cession.
But that's purportedly the way I read this is that you're not questioning the authenticity of the letter.
No, not at all. No.
So it's an authentic letter, but
Yes.
it was an incorrect
The
position.
cession itself is doubtful,
Yeah.
yes, correct. The letter was signed by the then CEO of the PIC, Dr. Dan Machila, and you'll note that the reference given as the person responsible for it was Mr. Raja, who at the time was an employee of the PIC and the PIC's nominee on the board of SA Home Loans. Mr. Ponya stated then and subsequently to me on a number of occasions that the Cession was the PIC's chosen method of compensating him for his interventions for which the SA Home Loans had denied liability.
Sorry, Mr. Stenton, can I just ask, in relation to the view that you would have or Home Loans would have about a board, Mr. Raja was a board member?
He was at the time a board member,
And
yes.
at the time, for a Mr. Raja as a board member being responsible for this on the part of the PIC, is there not a conflictual situation there?
There is, Madam Commissioner. There was and there is.
So did Home Loans go back to the PIC and say, look, Mr. Raja is a board member and it's inappropriate for him to be dealing with this on both sides of the fence?
I don't know if that happened, but I wasn't party to such a discussion. I'm then going to say that in 18, having regard to the circumstances where the company had declined to make a payment to Mr. Maponya or MMI itself, it was concerned about the circumstances under which it had now been told that it should pay this 45 million rand fee due to the GPF to a third party who happened to be a director and shareholder in the company, and they therefore referred the letter to Standard Bank, effectively to me, to ask for guidance on how to respond. We consider the cession by the PIC of a debt due by SA Home Loans to the GPF or alleged debt as a method of paying for services allegedly rendered by Ms. Maponya to the PIC, whilst she was both the director of SA Home Loans and stood to benefit as a significant shareholder from the 9 billion facility as being potentially irregular. As a consequence of
Just to check, to check something there. How did the 59.8 million become 45 million? The invoice was for that, and then the GPF then was supposed to get the 45. Just explain that, please.
My understanding is that built into the 59 was the 45 on this 9, and there was a separate facility granted for a development fund that was a discrete transaction. And so it was simply, he added the two amounts together and came to the 59. As a result of our lack of comfort over the session of the letter, I perhaps should mention, Commissioners, that at Standard Bank we try to be extra cautious in our dealings with pension funds. We regard, I think as a matter of law, the real owners of pension funds are the members of the funds. The members of the funds are by definition vulnerable people, and therefore we try when we deal with pension funds to ensure that those are their fair dealings and at reasonable prices, etc. And we were concerned that this disposal by an asset manager of an asset of 45 million to a service provider, rather than just paying the service provider with a check, as it were, was unusual, and it needed to be, we wanted to find out more. So as a result, we arranged Mr. Sim Chabalala, who was then the Chief Executive of Standard Bank. I say then because it was Standard Bank South Africa, he's now Chief Executive of the group, but then he was Chief Executive of Standard Bank South Africa. He and I met with Dr. Dan Machila personally, and we informed him that out of our concern the session might be irregular, we, Standard Bank, would oppose either the borrowers or SA Home Loans making payment to MMI rather than GPF pursuant to the session if the PIC could not provide evidence that the trustees of the GPF had approved, alternatively ratified the cession. And even if such approval or ratification was forthcoming, we would consider bringing such a cession of a pension fund's asset in these circumstances to the attention of the appropriate regulators. That was basically the import of the discussion we had. Dr. Machila informed us that he could not remember the circumstances under which the cession letter had been signed by him, but that he would look into the matter in the light of our concerns. And we
Sorry, what was the date then that you met with him? Do you know?
I can consult my diary, but it was shortly after the signature of the cession letter.
So if Dr. Machila signed on the 29th of April, which was the letter ceding its rights, it's the 29th of April, and the rescinding letter is the 10th of May, would this have occurred between that period?
Absolutely, Madam Commissioner, yes.
So the response then in paragraph 20 is that within a week he would not have remembered which letter he signed. That's what he's saying. If he cannot remember the circumstances under which the cession letter had been signed, but it wasn't like you're asking him to remember a year or 2 years before, you're asking him to remember a week before.
It's safe to deduce that, Madam Commissioner, yes.
That's why I'm just looking at
Yes,
the time.
correct,
That
yes,
reason.
it would have been,
It would have been within a recent
it was
period.
after that letter and before the rescinding letter was received.
So within a period of
within
10
that 10
days.
days, correct.
And
Yes.
his response is, I don't remember the circumstances of the signing. He
Yes.
didn't say, I don't remember signing. He doesn't remember the circumstances of signing.
He said more to the effect, he signs lots of things that are brought to him for signature. He doesn't remember this particular document. You'd have to look into it and come back to us.
Okay, so signing a session is not something that stands out. Okay.
I then in paragraph 21 say that shortly after the meeting, I didn't hear anything further from Dr. Machila, but shortly after that meeting, i.e., I think as we correctly point out, on the on the 10th of May, I think it was, a letter, the PIC delivered a letter to SA Home Loans, the borrowers. It too was signed by Dr. Machila and cited Mr. Raja as the originator of the letter for the PIC. In it, the PIC gave notice that there was no lawful basis for the cession of the 45 million claim by the GPF to MMI, and therefore the cession was retracted and rescinded. Obviously, the wording is, that's a summary of the wording, but that was our interpretation of what that letter purported to do. In the next paragraph, I point out that Ms. Paponia sought to challenge the lawfulness of the PIC's retraction and rescission of the purported cession and threatened to sue SHL for payment in terms of it. This was obviously disconcerting for us to have a director threatening to sue the company in these circumstances. And to try and avert that conflict at a board level, it was proposed that this whole dispute should rather be referred to the shareholders. BHC and MMI and Mr. Maponya typically really are regarded as one entity. They certainly behave as one entity. However, before the dispute was actually escalated to the shareholders, we were waiting for some sort of process to start. There's a prescribed process in the MOI. Before it happened, Ms. Paponia delivered a letter dated 4 November 2016. It's also in the pack of documents where he states that the cession for payment arranging fees had been returned to PIC with a request that payment should no longer be effected. And he said for that reason, the intended litigation over this fee has now been withdrawn, and it means that the issue of the conflict of interest in respect of him as a director against the company no longer existed, because we took issue with him as a director threatening to sue the company. There's also been an issue around the fact that when he sat as a director of the company to approve the 9 billion rand facility, he hadn't disclosed that he intended to claim this 45 million as a consequence of that transaction, which we think was a contravention of the Companies Act. So for all those reasons, he states in his letter, he thinks that having now surrendered this cession letter and having instructed the PIC that he no longer expected payment, that brought an end to the litigation threat, brought an end to the conflict, and consequently, SA Home Loans should proceed with the implementation of the transactions, etc., as validity is beyond reproach. It was after, as I understand, receipt of this letter that the SA Home Loans then paid the 45 million rand due to the GPF to the GPF. In paragraph 23, I then say that SPSA's understanding is that by the end of 2017, the 9 billion rand facility had been fully drawn down and advanced to the intended beneficiaries. SA Home Loans, in supervising their drawdown, ascertained there to be unsatisfied demand from members of the GPF for housing loans. It therefore applied to the GPF via the PIC for an additional 10 billion rand facility.
Was MMI in any way other than through the MMI was still on the board at that point in time?
Mr. Maponya was still on the board, yes.
And so was Mr. Raja?
Yes, so was Mr. Raja, yes.
So and Mr. Msaleko?
Masikesa? Yes, he was on the board.
So from that point of view, they were agreeing to this approach to the PIC GEPF for 10 billion as members of the board of SAHL. They would have approved that or been part of that decision to approach it. It was not in any other capacity.
That is my understanding, yes, Madam Commissioner. In the next paragraph, I point out that in the last quarter of 2018, Mr. Kevin Penwarden, the CEO of SA Home Loans, asked to consult with me in person about developments that he described as being of a highly sensitive and concerning nature. I and colleagues from the bank met with him and the SA Home Loans Company Secretary as a result of that request. They informed us that in September 2018, and at a time when SA Home Loans was awaiting a response to the 10 billion rand loan application, Mr. Masikeza and Mr. Maponya, acting together, informed a senior executive of SA Home Loans that they had been authorized by Dr. Machila to inform SA Home Loans that approval of the application for the additional 10 billion was conditional upon SA Home Loans agreeing to pay out of the proceeds 95 million rand to MMI as an origination fee. They explained that this was made up of the 45 million rand not paid in 2016, as set out above, plus another 50 million rand, i.e. 0.5% of 10 billion rand for the 10 billion rand facility under consideration. This information I refer to as the condition.
Question?
Yes.
Was this 10 billion approved and was the 95 million paid finally?
The 10 billion rand to date has neither been approved nor declined, as far as I know. And the 95 million rand was not paid.
It was not paid, okay.
Can I just ask in relation to this, how did you interpret this question of authorization, given that, if I recall correctly, Mr. Masikesa is his function is in the office of Dr. Machila? Did that give it weight that he was coming from the office of Dr. Machila as a board member to give you this information? Or was there, I mean, how did you interpret that authorization? Did you regard it as real?
Madam
Sorry,
Commissioner,
did anyone then actually phone or contact Dr. Machila to ask him whether he in fact authorized this? And given that this is now, 6 months later, 7 months later, that the home loan issue, the 10 billion, has not been addressed, how are you interpreting that, given that this is something that GPF itself is committed to in terms of housing its own members and so on?
Madam Commissioner, my recommendation to Mr. Penwarden at the time was that he should not accept this as sort of second-hand information, that he should contact Dr. Machila directly and ask for confirmation of this. And then I go on to say elsewhere that he should also consult with SA Home Loans' own lawyers to get clear advice as to what to do in the context of this, because it certainly was possible to interpret this information as a solicitation of a bribe. And if it was very concerning if Dr. Machila did know about it. If he didn't know about it, then it was in any event some sort of unlawful misrepresentation that he did know about it. So I recommended that they should get hold of him and get from him, as from the horse's mouth, as it were, what happened. I might mention, Madam Commissioner, that I was present yesterday when the oral evidence was presented. I didn't have insights into the annexures to the statements that were dealt with. But if you look at Mr. Rogers' statement of yesterday, I was this morning referred to Annexure M to his statement.
Sorry, just hang on a second. We can refer that to our files. I just want to get there. Annexure M. Yep. You got it?
I was unaware when I sort of hastily put together my statement yesterday afternoon that this document, which is a report that Mr. Penwarden gave to the Board of Directors as a whole, where he gives in great detail his account of what transpired. And there you will see that he said that he did attempt to contact Dr. Machila, but either he attempted to or he did intend to, but by the time he got around to doing it, he had resigned as the chief executive. So as far as I can tell, to date, he has not been contacted for his input on this.
Would the fact that he is no longer the CEO preclude you from contacting him? I mean, he still has responsibilities for authenticating this or otherwise. And this is, I mean, the date of this is yesterday. So this, the 29th of April, so this is a very recent matter on this Annexure M.
Yes, it
Yeah,
is. Yes,
yeah.
it is.
Would there have been an automatic preclusion from contacting him because he was no longer CEO?
Not that I'm aware of, Madam Commissioner. Mr. Penwarden then reported to us that he had taken advice and he had been advised that he had to undertake certain actions in terms of statutory duties. I don't deal them in my statement because it's a matter really between Mr. Penwarden, it's his personal obligations and that he had to satisfy. And I thought that he would be best placed to deal with that, but you will find in his statement, that's the document which is Annexure M to Mr. Rogers' statement, he deals with it in great detail as to what the advice was and what he's done with that advice.
Paragraph 25, you mentioned section 332 of the Criminal Procedure Act. Can you please explain to us that?
Yes, that's to do with corporate criminality. Effectively, as I understand it, if executives of a company commit crimes in the course and scope of their duties, then the corporate itself can be charged. And similarly, where a corporate is criminally liable, then the directors and co-responsible can be also charged. I said you need to just look into this. If there was criminality, they need to be very concerned about the impact on the company itself.
Oh, okay.
Mr. Penwarden then reported to me that when the auditors of SA Home Loans asked him as part of the closing out of the December 2018 financial year audit, if there are any irregular conduct on the part of management or executives that he ought to disclose, he mentioned this whole incident and the legal advice that had been obtained and the consequences that followed from that.
Can I just ask, does that cover para 26, where Mr. Penwarden says that he had complied with his statutory obligations? Were the statutory obligations a broader reporting?
Yes,
than that?
I'm referring there, Madam Commissioner, to Section 34 of the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act.
So he reported in terms of that act to who?
To the Hawks, Madam
To
Commissioner.
the Hawks.
Yes. The auditors, on learning of these events, gave notice that they would report what had happened as an irregularity as envisaged in Section 45 of the Auditing Profession Act. And they specifically stated in the document which was circulated by them that in their opinion, not being lawyers, but in their opinion as auditors, what had occurred was a contravention of Section 3 of the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act, which again, my understanding, it's a solicitation of a bribe to induce a contract.
Coming back again to paragraph 26, when did Mr. Penwarden report this case to the Hawks? Can you recall?
I can't give you a date, Mr. Commissioner, but it was after he received the legal advice that he was obliged to do so.
All right.
I do know it was this year, not
Or
last
just
year. Yeah.
2019.
Okay.
2019, okay.
On 2019, I think on paragraph 29, on about the 16th of April, I think this was mentioned yesterday, MMI issued summons against a range of PIC and a range of other parties, including SA Home Loans, in which he's claiming payment of the 45 million rand based upon the Cession. And the only reason I've mentioned here, because it needs to be mentioned, I think, that he's suing for that money despite the letter which he wrote saying, I have returned the document, I no longer expect to be paid, and as a consequence of that, SA Home Loans paid GPF directly the money, so they no longer have the funds. And that's relevant, I think. And then perhaps paragraph...
Sorry, just before you move on from that, you did mention earlier that in a way, the MMI and BHC were interchangeable. But if I understood the shareholding, MMI is one of the shareholders within BHC. BHC is the counterparty. How would MMI sue if the counterparty in SHL or the investor in SHL is BHC and not MMI?
There's two answers, Madam Commissioner. Firstly, when I say they're interchangeable, they're not clearly legally interchangeable.
That's why I'm asking the question.
They each have a
because
distinct
legally it's got its own
legal,
different-
they each have a distinct legal personality, and there's a hierarchy. However, as recently as last month, we had a shareholders meeting called by BHC, and the only item on the agenda was the non-payment of this 45 million rand fee to MMI. So when I asked Ms. Paponya on what basis we need to call a meeting of shareholders to discuss the non-payment of MMI, he said because BHC and MMI are, for all intents and purposes, one and the same person.
Paragraph, yeah, coming back
So,
to...
sorry, may I finish, Mr. Commissioner?
Okay.
The second
All right.
issue is the cause of action in the summons, as I understand it, is the Cession. The case is that the PIC signed that Cession letter where the cessionary, the cedent is GPF, the cessionary is MMI, and therefore MMI is the plaintiff in that litigation. Sorry.
Okay, paragraph 28, you mentioned that this could contravene section 3 of the PCCA. Can you just explain further there, please?
Yes, the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act prohibits a wide range of activities which are defined by law to be illegal, and contravention of the Act has very serious penalties. The Act then is divided into various sections, and as I understand, Section 3 is the section which makes it illegal for inducements to be offered to persuade people to enter into contracts in an improper manner, effectively. And the auditors deemed what happened here to be an attempt to induce a contract through a 95 million rand bribe. In paragraph 30, I mentioned that in April, the draft audit financial statements for SA Home Loans were presented to the Audit and Risk Committee for approval and recommendation to the respective boards. The auditors attended the meeting to explain why they had included this reference to irregularity, and Mr. Penwarden tabled a detailed written report of what had transpired, what advice he had been given, etc., which is substantially in the form of Annexure M to Mr. Rogers' statement. Not surprisingly, when Mr. Masakeza and Ms. Maponya learnt of this, they were somewhat agitated and demanded an urgent board meeting to put their side of the story and to challenge what had happened, and just generally try to I suppose, have their side of the story heard and debated. And that board meeting, I think, is ongoing as we speak. So that's where we are in the current state of affairs.
What is the term of office of the PIC representatives? I mean, of all your board, anyway, it would be a 3-year renewable. What is their term of office and how far along are they?
I don't know the answer offhand, Madam Commissioner, but it is contained in the MOI. I don't believe there is a term for those who are appointed by a shareholder. I don't believe there's a fixed term. My recollection is that each shareholder who holds more than a specified percentage is entitled to appoint a person of the board, and I don't think there's a time limit. I can, if you would like, page 36. So, yes, but I say, Madam Commissioner, on paragraph 40.1.6 of the MOI, each director shall serve for an indefinite term.
Just a final question from me, just to be clear. So the 10 billion facility hasn't been approved, and the GEP people are waiting for such loans, and is it mainly because of that condition?
That is our understanding, yes, Mr. Commissioner.
I just want to take you to the beginning a bit in the light of Assistant Commissioner Lidiga's question about origination of the deal. I just want your understanding of the deal origination with regard to this appraisal report that was drafted by the PIC in 2013, which was after the submission by SA Home Loans. And I would refer the commission to the appraisal report, SA Home Loans, just on the first page, so that he can just clarify the point that Commissioner, there was a question that he had asked regarding the time periods and the origination of the deal.
Which document do you want to refer to?
Sorry, the appraisal report, which was a separate document dated 2013.
Yeah. Which part of the report then? Which section? Which area?
The first block that describes what the deal is about.
Okay. All right.
Yes, in answer, the document in front of me describes the project as Namasek Pty Limited trading as B8 Consortium having approached the PIC to jointly acquire JP Morgan's 50% shareholding in SA Home Loans, which it sets out in this document. Then on the next page, there is an executive summary where at paragraph 2 it says SA Home Loans was founded in February 1999, its head office in Durban. Paragraph 3 says more than a year ago. Now this document is dated 2013. It acknowledges that more than a year ago, PIC was approached by SA Home Loans to provide funding through a securitization structure in order to expand its operations. And then 4, PIC indicated that it was interested in acquiring an equity interest prior to giving any consideration for provision of a credit facility. So they acknowledge that the PIC, more than a year before this paper, had indicated a willingness to acquire an equity before providing credit. And then subsequently, JP Morgan commenced upon a process to sell its stake. The point I made at the outset was that I've been given a copy of two presentations that were sent to me, which I understand Mr. Pina Warden of SA Home Loans is in discussions with the investigators to present to this commission, but one is dated June 2012, in which there's a proposal for funding, and then there's another presentation dated September 2012, in which SA Home Loans invites the GPF through the PIC to acquire an equity stake. So all of this took place well before this paper was put to the board of the PIC.
It does, answer the question then. Yeah. Yeah? Okay.
I just want to confirm that Annexure M is before the commission, as it was part of the annexures of Mr. Roy Raja yesterday.
Yeah, we do have that. We do have that.
Is that it in relation to this witness?
I beg your pardon.
Is that it in relation to this witness?
That concludes the testimony of Mr. Ian Stenton.
Mr. Stenton.
There were 4 people mentioned that this implicates the 4 people. Can you give us the names of the people, if possible, who are
It's Mr.
implicated?
Den Machila, Roy Raja, Wellington Masegesa, and Mr. Maponya.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Stenton. Thanks for your time, and thanks for volunteering to come and testify to us, clearing certain matters. Certain matters have been cleared, and we really are grateful to you for your time and effort.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
For now, you are excused.
Yes,
I
but
say this-
I have one more question, if I may. I have undertaken to respond with factual answers to various questions which I couldn't answer here. Is it enough that I put that in a supplementary statement, or must I come back?
I would prefer it if you were to put it down on a statement, for that statement to be an affidavit rather than just a plain statement.
Fine, thank you, Thank you,
Right.
Mr. Chairman.
But if it happens that we need to call you again to clear up more matters or issues, please avail yourself. That might happen.
And perhaps for the team, it would be very useful for us to get the outcome of today's board meeting when available. Thank you.
Thank you.
Will do so, Commissioner.
So I'm excused, Mr. Commissioner.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you.
You're excused. We'll take the adjournment until 11:20.
Thank you, Commissioner.
the statutory actuarial valuation as at 31 March 2018, he will take the prescribed oath. Can you just stand up, please? Put on the microphone. Thank you.
Are those your full names, Mr. Pinar? Andre Pinar?
Andre Ronald Pina,
Ronald.
Mr. Commissioner, yes.
Do you have any objection to taking the prescribed oath?
No, I don't, Mr. Commissioner.
Do you swear that the evidence you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth? Raise your right hand and say, so help me God.
So help me God.
Thank you very much. You may be seated.
Thank you, Mr. Pina. Will you just speak close to the microphone, please? Is it correct that you have prepared a presentation which in essence is the same that you presented to the GEPF Board of Trustees previously?
That is correct. It's a presentation I gave to the board in November 2018.
You were born and bred in this part of the world? Is that right?
Yes, I was born in Johannesburg in 1958, and I've lived most of my life in Johannesburg except for 12 years in Cape Town.
Where did you study?
I studied at St. Stithians College in Randburg and then University of Cape Town, and then I wrote the actuarial exams through the Institute of Actuaries in London.
And I believe you qualified in 1986.
That's correct.
Can you just tell the Commission a bit about of your background as an actuary? Where did you work? Your experience?
I worked at Old Mutual from 1981 until early 1993, and then I moved across to Alexander Forbes, and I've been there now for 26 years, and I've been a pension funds actuary, valuator, and consultant for 30 years now.
Thank you very much. Can we just then start with your presentation? The first page, discussion items, is basically the agenda of your presentation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then, can you just deal then with the objectives of your valuation?
So we look at the third page. Just as background, I think a lot of what I covered in the presentation is fairly technical, aimed at the trustees. So I'll try and focus on what I believe is probably more relevant to your interests.
Please do so.
So in terms of the objectives, the top one is really to investigate the financial position of the fund. So it's really a solvency test. We compare the assets of the fund to the liabilities to determine if the fund is solvent. The second objective is to analyze what happened since the previous valuation, and these valuations are done every 2 years. Based on that analysis and based on changes in the market and our predictions for the future, we then, in the third objective, review the assumptions to be used, and I will later on set out in detail the assumptions.
And please tell the Commission, on what do you base your assumptions?
The assumptions are based on market indicators, so we don't just make them up. We actually look at what the market is telling us in terms of bond rates, for example, expected inflation rates.
Thank you.
The fourth objective is we look at certain reserves. Now, these reserves are not required to be held. They are nice to have, but they are there to protect the fund and the sponsoring employers. The fifth objective is to look at what contribution rate is required from the employers going forward to ensure that in 2 years' time, when we do the next valuation, the fund will still be financially sound. And the last objective is to analyze the nature of the investments on a broad base and ensure that they are appropriate given the nature and duration of the liabilities. And that we cover in great detail in pages 17 and 18 of our valuation report. If I may continue, Mr. Commissioner.
Just for the record, apart from your presentation, the full report is also attached to your presentation.
That's right.
Thank you.
So the next few slides are really detail. It just shows the next one that the active membership, those are your contributing members, stayed roughly the same at 1.28 million over the 2 years. on the following slide, we can see that the number of pensioners increased from 413,000 to 441,000. And obviously the payrolls of the membership and the payrolls of the pensioners increased over the 2 years. The following slide, headed membership pensioners, just gives slightly more detail of the build-up over the pensioners. The following slide is headed financial assumptions, best estimate basis. And I'm going to just spend some time.
Just to connect it again, that is the assumptions that you say you get from the markets.
That's right. So these are very long-term assumptions. So we're looking at the next 19 to 21 years. And the reason for that is before we set the assumptions, we look at the average duration of the liabilities. So for the pensioners, we've calculated on average that the average duration is about 10 years. So if we look at the monthly payments we're going to make to existing pensioners, and we work out the average of that, we expect on average to pay pensioners for about 10 years. So there'd be some very old pensioners who maybe got 2 or 3 years life expectancy, some young pensioners with 30 years, on average it's about 10 years. For the active members, we've calculated that the average duration is about 21 years. So if you put those two groups together, the average duration of the overall liabilities is around 19 years. So with that as a base, we then look at the markets and say, what can the fund invest in to match liabilities for 19 years? And we start with government bonds as an appropriate investment for the fund, given that some of the liabilities are fixed in nature. What I mean by that is, we know for existing pensioners we have to pay a certain rand pension every month if we ignore increases. We look at the active members, we know that their liabilities will grow because they're going to have extra service every year, and for a moment we ignore salary increases, and on that basis we have certain fixed liabilities that we know, and therefore government bonds are appropriate. So we start with the 19-year government bond rates, and that is the 9.4% in the second row under 2018 valuation. We then look at certain other bonds in the market. So we look at what we call inflation-linked bonds, where you can buy an investment from the government which gives you a return exactly equal to inflation. And the difference between those two bond rates, the government bond rates, where the 19-year return was 9.4% on the valuation date, the inflation-linked bonds, which at the same date we're giving 2.4%, the difference is what the market is estimating inflation will average over the next 18 to 19 years. And then we make a small adjustment because we expect investors will want a slightly higher return on bonds than just inflation, and that's the other 0.5%. So the market is saying for the next 19 years from the valuation date, they expect average inflation to be 6.5% per annum. Now obviously it won't be that every year, it will be higher in some years, lower in other years, but that's the market's best estimate. We then look at the expected investment return over the next 19 years on the fund. Again, we start with a bond rate of 9.4%. We then expect that on equities, the fund can do slightly better, because you would only invest in equities if you could get a higher return than bonds, because bonds are safer. And the estimate that we've made is that on equities, you'd get 3% higher return than on bonds. And if we assume that 60% of the fund is invested in equities, which has been the average of the last number of years, 60% of that extra 3% means we can add 1.8% expected return over the next 19 years. And the 9.4 plus the 1.8 gives us an expected return on assets of 11.2%. And then we make a slightly higher assumption for salary increases. We expect it to be 1% above inflation, based on expected long-term productivity improvements in the country. And then the key number there is the one in a grey block, 3.44. So we're expecting over the next 19 years the investment return to exceed salary increases by 3.44% per annum. Similarly, on pensioners, again, we expect to earn 11.2, the same return. We're expecting inflation increases to pensioners at 80% of inflation every year, which is 5.2. Again, we're expecting a difference being the return net of pension increases of 5.7%. So those are the key assumptions going forward on the fund. And again, those are very long-term assumptions. We don't expect that to happen every 2 years. So if we have a 2-year period as we just had, where investment returns were below expected, then we'd have slight negative improvements in the fund. Other 2-year periods, it would be the reverse, and the fund would do much better than expected. But over the 19 years, on average, our best estimate are those long-term returns.
Just a question. This is a broader question. Just in terms of this fund is a defined benefit fund and versus a defined contribution fund. In a defined benefit fund, do the workers and the pensioners know their amounts, their pension amounts? Because within a DC, you will know that I got 500,000 or $1 million, but does that happen within a defined contribution fund? Defined benefit, yeah.
Mr. Commissioner, yes, if the two funds work very differently. Defined contribution fund, can see any day or any month what your savings account is worth. Defined benefit fund is slightly more different because we funding towards a promise for when you retire. So we're building up to have the right amount at the date that you retire. The members are given benefit statements every year, which will tell them what they expect to get at age 60 or at age 65 based on certain assumptions. But they also get told what their RAND value in the fund is at the moment were they to resign. So they do also have access to a RAND amount, but the focus is more on building up enough so by the time they retire, there's enough money to buy their promised pension. Now, in a defined contribution fund, that RAND amount that you can see if you go onto the website of the administrator will fluctuate from day to day as investment markets fluctuate. Similarly, the quoted withdrawal benefit that you can take from the fund if you resign could fluctuate when the actuarial assumptions change.
That's great. Okay, so I wasn't aware that you can actually see your money in a defined benefit fund. Yeah. All right, that's good. That's good.
Okay, so the heading there was best estimate assumptions. Now, actuaries unfortunately don't have crystal balls. They're making estimates about the future based on the past and based on the current markets. But best estimate should mean there's a 50% chance of doing better and 50% chance of doing worse. But they're just estimates. Later on, I'll show you some of the sensitivity analysis we do to indicate to the trustees how variable the results could be if the assumptions were to change. So the next slide just gives some more information. I did cover all that. So moving on to the next one, which is headed valuation results.
Just another question before we go on slide on the financial assumptions. Below there you got ill health and normal health rates. I just wanted to take, so this fund will give you a pension, but it will give you post-retirement medical payments or what? Is that, no?
No, Mr. Commissioner, this is the only objective of the fund is to provide you with a pension when you retire. Medical aid is a totally separate benefit that's provided. So what we mean at the bottom there is we are funding for the member to get to his normal retirement age, which is 60 for most members, and then get a normal pension. But were he to become disabled or ill health before that, he could get an earlier pension based on a slightly different formula, which is still payable for life, but it starts before his normal retirement age that he was expected to reach.
That's okay. That's clearer now. Yeah, all right. Okay.
Okay, I didn't focus much on the demographic assumptions. They are important, but they have less of an impact than the financial assumptions which I have described. The only one to be aware of is that there is an international trend for pensioners to live longer and longer. So we need to make assumptions about improvements in mortality once pensioners retire.
But if you looked at the fund you're looking at in relation to that demographic, how does that relate as, because this is if you like, a defined population of a certain standing, which may be different from your life expectancy in the population as a whole. So if one had to look at this, what is the assumption you make in relation to life expectancy? And therefore, I think it relates to your earlier question of whether you fund for so many years. It is an assumption, I just want to try and see my note, is an assumption that you would fund for what period of time? You would fund pensioners for 10 years. So the assumption is that your longevity is 60 or 65, depending on the pensionable age, for a period of 10 years.
Madam Commissioner, not strictly correct. When we talk about the duration of a pensioner, it's actually the average duration of each monthly payment we're going to make.
Okay.
So a 60-year-old pensioner, we probably expect to live for about 20 to 22 years.
Okay.
And if it's a male with a
Little less.
spouse a few years younger, we expect her to maybe go for another 5 years.
Yeah.
But when we look at your duration, we discount each monthly payment. So when I'm saying a duration of 10, it could be based on a life expectancy of 20, but we're looking at when we expect
When
to
you
make the
expect
payments, yes.
Okay.
Just want to check, are you planning to deal with this minimum funding level and the later, yeah? Is that correct? Okay, because I've got questions there.
Okay, I think that's covered on the next slide, which is headed valuation results. Now, these figures are all in millions. Now, we've set out the results from 2 years previously and the results of 31 March 2018. The very top line is the value of the assets, and that we obtain from the audited financial statements of the fund. So the fund had 1.8 trillion assets at the valuation date. The next 5 figures are all the best estimate present values of the liabilities of the fund as of the valuation date. And those 5 figures total 1,663 billion. So the difference is of assets less liabilities, 137 billion rand. So the fund was financially sound. It was 108% funded if we ignore any contingency reserves we might want to set up. That's a slight drop from 115% 2 years previously, but I'll give you more insight into the trends in a few slides' time.
So it's about a 7% drop in the 2-year period.
That's right. And I'll explain also why it dropped. We then look at the recommended or desired reserves that we would like to hold in the fund, and they set out below there. The main one is the solvency reserve, which is there as a buffer in case the assumptions turn out to be grossly incorrect. And the 2 biggest risks I normally mention there are pensioners living longer than expected and a catastrophe in investment markets. But those are nice to have reserves. If you haven't got them, it doesn't mean your fund is unsound because the assets still exceed the liabilities. So if the fund were to continue and all our assumptions prove out to be exactly correct, there's enough money in the fund to pay all the existing members for the rest of their lives. But as you see, the funding level before reserves went from 115 to 108%. The funding level after the desired reserves went from 79 to 75%.
When you say desired reserves, is that an assumption that that will be made? You've got it in red?
No, sorry, the red is there because that figure was provided at the last minute by the asset consultants. So this was a second presentation we did, so we just put in the red figures because they were the figures that came in very late. It doesn't have any relevance, the color, to the position of the fund.
Those should be treated as the same, that in actual fact the 402, the 301 has become 402.
That's right, yes. Madam Commissioner, yes.
So can one then say that really the biggest figure to worry about is the minimum funding level, which is the 108%?
That's correct, Mr. Commissioner.
If that goes below 100%, that's when you should worry because then your liabilities are higher than the assets.
Yes, Mr. Commissioner. Although the fund's target is that should never go below 90%.
Oh, okay, yeah.
The logic there is that as long as you've got a large sponsoring employer standing behind the fund who's willing to put in money to make up any shortfall, then there's no need for any concern. The concern would be if the fund did get to a low funding level and the employer said we can't afford to put money in, and then you have a shortfall.
When was the last time, sorry.
Yeah.
But if you look at the situation elsewhere in the world, it is not standard practice that every government fully pre-funds their government employees' pension fund. Many countries operate on the basis of a pay-as-you-go basis, that they only pay in money when it's needed to pay benefits. So we are in a fortunate position that our government has pre-funded the liabilities and there's enough money to cover the liabilities that the fund has already accrued for all the existing members and pensioners.
Let's follow up there. So when can it happen that the government can be called on to make good on the fund? At what percentage levels?
Can I add to that? When was the last time, if it was done, that this fund needed to be topped up?
Okay, I unfortunately, Madam Commissioner, have only been the actuary since last April, but I was asked by the GEPF to do a paper just to explain the trends, but we only looked back as far as 2006, and the minimum funding level got as low as 102% in March 2012 and 108% in March 2010. So we're back at those levels, but there were some valuations where it was as high as 120%. So we aren't in a very different position to where the fund was 7 or 9 years ago. And as regards the long-term funding level, which is now 75.5%, that got as low as 70% in 2012. To answer the Commissioner's question as to when something would need to happen, my understanding is that the policy of the fund is to always target to be at least 90% funded on the minimum funding level. So at that stage, there'd have to be a serious meeting between the trustees and the employers. But at every year, those discussions do take place, and the employers provide their input as to how to take the fund forward.
Okay, so if we had to reach 85% minimum funding level, then somehow the government would have to come in and maybe to increase the contributions, possibly?
That's right, Mr. Commissioner. Rule 7.2 of the fund's rules, which I've got on a later slide, says that the employer contributions should be sufficient to ensure that the fund is able to meet its obligations at all times, subject to a minimum funding level of 90%. So that's really the primary funding objective of the fund.
So meaning that then the taxpayers will have to fund that difference between, you know, below the 90% and 90%, yeah?
That's right, Mr.
Through
Commissioner.
taxes or through debt or whatever, yeah?
Yes, it doesn't have to be done immediately. There could be a scheme to pay an extra 2 or 3% contributions for a number of years. So there are many different ways to make it up, yes.
Yeah, that's
But
good.
as you say, according to the research you've done in the past decade, it was not necessary to top up the fund.
It hasn't been necessary for at least the last 15 years. So on the next slide, I've given some trends, and they do look disturbing in that all the percentages are dropping. But as I've just pointed out, just before 2014, the fund was in a similar position to where it was now. So if we look at the minimum funding level, it's dropped from 121% in 2014 to 108% now. But in 2010, it was 108%, and 2012, 102.7%. The long-term funding level has dropped from 83 to 75 over the last 4 years. But in 2010, it was 74%, and 2012, 70%. So although the fund is not as well funded as members and the employers would like, the assets do exceed the liabilities by quite a fair margin still. Okay, on the next slide, we talk about the solvency reserve, which, as I mentioned, is the biggest reserve. And we look at a number of methods of calculating it, but the trustees have in the past used the asset consultants to do certain stochastic modeling, which they call the asset liability modeling approach, and that's where the 402 billion rand figure came in. And again, it's in red just because it was added at the last minute. And over the page is a bit more detail on the other contingency reserves. And again, just to point out that the second last column, headed 31 March 2018 required, is the desirable or recommended reserves, or let's call it nice to have reserves. And the very last column is what is currently affordable. So we take the difference between the assets and liabilities. That's what the fund has available to cover contingency reserves at the moment.
Yes, thank you. You can proceed.
Just in terms of the long-term funding rate, just explain it again. You know, why do we need to worry about that if we got the minimum funding rate sorted out?
Mr. Commissioner, it's international best practice and the recommendation of the Financial Sector Conduct Authority that you don't only hold enough assets to cover the liabilities, but you have a small buffer or extra margin as well. The way I normally describe it to clients is to say, we first do the valuation on the best estimate assumptions. We then do the valuation a second time on more conservative assumptions. The big things that could go wrong. And the difference between those two valuations is what are the reserves that we would recommend holding, if you can afford it. So it is desirable to move towards having those reserves, but even the FSCA would not see a fund as unsound if it didn't hold the reserves. Because the key thing is that the assets must exceed the liabilities on the best estimate basis.
And then that 75% needs to move to 100%. Is that the normal, you know, covering both the minimum funding level and the contingencies?
That's correct. That's the desired level is to cover the liabilities in full and the recommended reserves.
But the government doesn't have to put actual money. It must just be tracked and all that and see where the number is going, isn't it?
That would be my view, Mr. Commissioner, yes.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
as long as the government, as a sponsoring employer, is aware of the position
Yes.
and understands that should that minimum funding level drop below 90% or even 100%, they would need to be in a position to help get the position back to 100% funded.
But that would be something that would be planned over a number of years. It wouldn't be something that says, this next valuation, we have to be at the 100%. It's something that says, we're addressing this, and over the next few years, this is what would come back to the levels.
That's correct, Madam Commissioner. If we look at private sector funds, the FSCA would normally give the fund 9 years to get back to a fully funded position if it fell into a deficit. So there must be a plan between the employer and the trustees and the actuary to move towards that position. It doesn't have to do it overnight. Okay, going on to the following slide, which is headed Analysis of the Profits and Losses. This just explains how the position changed over the 2 years. So if you recall, we had a 227 billion rand excess of assets over liabilities in 2016, which is the top line on that page. If we just move forward 2 years and look at what we expected the fund to earn, now in the previous valuation, the long-term investment return was 12.5%. We would have expected to now be in a position of 281.9 billion excess, all other things being equal. So if every actuarial assumption made in 2016 had been borne out exactly in practice, that's where we would be now. But as we know, things don't happen that way. The actual experience can be very different to what's expected. And so then we explain why we've got 137 million excess now, not 281. And the biggest reasons are the ones highlighted in bold. So investment returns over the 2 years averaged 6.5% per annum versus the expectation of 12.5% per annum, and that caused a negative impact of 225 billion. That was slightly offset by the next line, in that through the changes in interest rates over the 2 years, which would affect the liabilities going forward, there was a positive impact of 81 billion. So it's really the difference that's important. So we had 140 billion negative impact basically due to investment markets. And most of that would be due to what was happening globally, in that investment returns over the last 4 or 5 years have been disappointing. In fact, our local stock market, where the fund has 60% of its assets invested, has hardly beaten inflation over the last 5 years. So it's been a disappointing market impact, which has caused this change. And there are a few other smaller items which are very small compared to those two large ones.
Can you say that 6.5% return, is that what the PIC generated for the GEPF?
That was the return, yes, that the fund earned on its assets over the 2 years.
Over the 2 years, yes.
I think it was 4 point something in the 1 year and 8 point something in the other year. It's all set out in the detailed report. But the average over the 2 years was 6.5% per annum,
okay.
net of any investment fees that are paid.
Okay, all right.
Okay, the following slide is really detailed. It's called the notional pension accumulation account. It just shows what the position of the pensioners in the fund would be if the pensioners had their own separate fund. So it's more as background for the trustees than of relevance, I think, today. And in the next 2 slides, or 3 slides, set out what the employers should be contributing going forward to ensure that they're covering exactly the new benefits that are being generated each year. We first look at a combined basis, because there are actually 2 different groups of members, which I'll explain later. So the required employer contribution rate was 15.6% in 2016. It It's dropped to 15.2% 2018, mainly due to the changes in interest rates going forward. And the current employer contribution rate is 13.5%. So the employer is slightly under-contributing, as it has been done for many years, but it is an improvement over the last 2 years. If we move on 2 slides, we just show that split, because you have 2 groups of members in the GEPF. We have what we call the services members and the other members. There's a slight difference in the benefits of the 2, and so they actually have their own contribution rates. So that just shows more detail. So the employer is actually contributing 16% for services members and 13% for other members, both of which are slightly lower than what is required going forward. So it's the same point as 2 slides earlier. And we do show somewhere in the report the impact of the employer continuing to under-contribute. In fact, it's on a slide later. It would cause the minimum funding level to decrease by about 0.3% per annum if that continues.
Just another question here. You know, this commission is looking at some investments of the PIC, and what appears in the community is that this fund is losing money and it will be bankrupt at some point. But what I wanted to ask you is, there are many ways that the minimum funding level can go down. Can you explain to us what can cause a pension fund to go down in terms of funding levels? Because I think people focus just on the investments part.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. If we go back to the slide, about 4 slides back, headed Analysis of the Profits and Losses. So basically, any impact where the actuary's made an assumption and the actual experience is a lot worse than that could cause the funding level to drop. So the biggest one would be investment returns. So the actuary estimates future investment returns from the markets. We then have a calamity in the world, 2008 financial crisis. Last year, most asset classes around the world gave negative returns, not just in South Africa. So any negative impact on investment markets would have an impact on the fund, because you're generating a lower return than you anticipated. But there are many others that could cause it. As I mentioned earlier, pensioners living longer than expected. So if we expect the average pensioner at 60 to live for 22 years, and a new drug were to come out which would add 5 years to the average lifetime of every pensioner, that could bankrupt the fund, because it would add a huge extra liability. Salary increases, another one. We make assumptions about future salary increases. If the salary increases are much higher than anticipated, that causes liabilities to grow faster than expected. So all of the main assumptions we make, if they move against the fund in that salary increases are higher, pension increases are higher, life expectancy is longer, investment returns are lower, they could cause the funding level to drop.
And if the pension fund has got unlisted investments of say 100 billion or somewhere there, and 3 billion is lost there in Nigeria, 2 billion is lost somewhere, can this put the fund in serious danger?
If assets turn out to be bad investments and the fund loses money, it would reduce the return earned by the fund, which would impact on the fund. But the amounts that you mentioned would not have a significant impact on the funding level, because I think if you take a 6 billion rand loss, it would be point something impact on the fund. So it is a serious amount of money, but given the size of this fund, it would not have a huge impact on the funding level of the fund.
Thank you.
There is a slide headed sensitivity analysis, and all that does is show the impact on the funding levels of slightly different assumptions. So it's more as background for the trustees to show which are the more serious assumptions and what could happen if those assumptions prove to be incorrect. So when the actuary comes up with a figure for a funding level, it is just an estimate using his best estimate assumptions going forward. It doesn't mean that's exactly what the fund position is. You will only know whether there's enough money to cover all the liabilities when the last member and pensioner have died or left the fund, so in 100 years' time. So it's a very difficult situation to explain to trustees that you're making best estimates, you're coming up with figures, but you can't say categorically that the fund is 108.3% funded because it's based on many assumptions about the future.
So now, just coming back to the dangers that the fund faces if, things don't go right, would you say that the JSE, the stock market, is more of a bigger danger to the fund than, the private equity side, the unlisted side?
Yes, Mr. Commissioner, I'd have to agree with that. If you consider that the unlisted investments are a small percentage of the fund, whereas the JSE exposure is about 60% of the fund, if the JSE were to fall 5%, that would have a much bigger impact than a few unlisted investments being bad investments.
Sorry, you may have covered it and I might not have followed it properly. What is the proportion of the funding for the fund as a whole of contribution, government pensioner contribution and investment contribution to if you had to look at the fund as a whole? 100% of funding would be the combination of investment earnings, government contribution, pensioner contribution. What is the percentage between what is regularly deducted and goes in the fund, as well as the percentage that would be formed from your various investments in total?
Madam Commissioner, that's a very interesting question and I can't answer it. Basically, the members pay a fixed contribution rate. I think it's...
Members, I think, is 5% and government is 15%, or it was at one point. It might be different, but if I remember, in the private sector, it would be up to, individuals can contribute up to 7.5%.
Okay.
And
so in this fund, the members contribute 7.5%.
Right, and government 15%.
The government pays 13% for other members and 16% for services members.
Okay, so that is a monthly flow into the fund.
That's right. So of every member's salary,
That is deducted.
about
and goes into the fund.
22.5% of his salary is
Goes in.
going into the fund,
Right.
and then the investment returns are added to the assets. But I can't
But I
give you the
would be
mix.
interested in the proportion as to what is the dependency. The question I'm really asking is what is the dependency on earned investment to keep the fund level at what it is, as distinct from that monthly contribution? Is there a way you could look at that and come back to us? Is that possible?
Madam Commissioner, we can try. It's not something we normally do. I mean, to me, the key figures are, if you go back to our best estimate assumptions, what we need is the fund's investment returns to be 3 to 5% above inflation. That's the most important aspect of the fund.
I understand that, but my question is the dependency on monthly contributions that come in. Assume that that forms 80% of the fund. I mean, I'm just making an assumption, it's got no validity to that. That your monthly contributions contribute 80% of what your requirement would be, and a 20% depends on the various investments to make sure that you reach your, as it is, 108% of funding. So I'm just trying to understand or get a better grip on what is the level of dependency on the financial markets as distinct from the regular flow in from the normal deductions. And if it's not possible, that's okay, but it would just be something I was just curious about.
If we look at the assets of the fund being 1.8 trillion, and we assume that we're looking at a return of about 11% a year, we would expect 198, I'm guessing that's billion rand a year coming in investment returns. The contributions coming into the fund, what about 65 billion rand a year? So investment returns, the expected investment returns are about 3 times the contribution inflow.
So it's 3 to 1, really
That's right.
speaking. Your contribution is 25% and your investment is 75%.
That's right, Madam Commissioner.
Just to follow up there, can it happen that the investment return is lower than the benefits paid out? So sort of the return plus the contributions are lower than the benefits paid out. Can it happen?
Mr. Commissioner, it could happen. In fact, I've got many clients where there are mostly only pensioners left and not members. So you've got no contributions coming in, but you're paying out large amounts in pensions to the pensioners, which is not an issue because we value the fund, we value each member and pensioner's liability, and if there were no active members left and no contributions coming in, as long as we've set up enough money to pay each pensioner for life, it doesn't matter that we're paying out a lot more in benefits than we're getting in contributions and investment income. It will just impact on the liquidity or the cash flow and mean that you've got to hold more liquid investments than illiquid ones. But it doesn't really matter if the cash flow becomes negative.
Meaning that for the GEPF, I mean, given that the pensioners are only 400,000 and you got like, what, 1.2 million members, that, I mean, the contributions will keep coming.
Mr. Commissioner, yes, at the moment, the fund is getting in, as I said, 65 million in contributions every year. It's paying out pensions of 38 billion a year, but there are other benefits as well, which are about 60 billion a year. So already the outflow is roughly equal to the inflow. But again, it's not serious as long as the trustees and the asset managers are aware of the liquidity issues and make sure that the assets that they're holding are appropriate to provide the liquidity to pay benefits. Okay, the last few slides basically cover the certifications by the actuaries, and it's all ground that we have covered. It talks about the different funding levels, which is the most important. It talks about what the rules cover, which I've covered. And basically we're certifying that we believe the fund is financially sound because the assets cover the liabilities. We certify that the asset structure or the investment strategy is appropriate based on the nature and duration of the liabilities. And apart from the fact that the employer is slightly under-contributing, and we point out the impact of that, we had no other concerns about the financial position of the fund.
But I think that perhaps the biggest concern, and again it's a long-term matter, is that the fund therefore does not meet its long-term funding objective at the valuation date.
That is correct. We would prefer to be closer to 100% Y as the actuary, and I'm sure the employers and members, closer to 100% funded, including all the recommended reserves. But as I said, you have to balance that against the needs of the employers, the needs of the country, and there are many competing interests for those additional contributions.
All right. I've got 2 questions on the asset side. The asset side, and I hope you can answer that because I think the GPF will probably be here too, to look at that. Pension funds need to diversify their risk, okay? So just in terms of the global allocation and the sort of Africa, global and the Africa allocations. I think that close to like 5% each or so. Are we happy with that amount, or that needs to increase? And I hope like the unions are not gonna kill me for this. Because when you look at various pension funds, their global portions go to like 20%, 30%, you know. So can you please just clarify that for me?
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Yeah, if you look at worldwide experience, the research shows that to properly diversify a fund, you probably want 30 to 40% of the assets outside of the country. Now, there is a bit of a contradiction there, because all the liabilities are in South Africa in rands. So if you're holding assets outside, you are mismatching from a currency point of view. But as you rightly say, in terms of a diversification of risk, you don't want to have all your eggs in one basket. So investing offshore does give the fund access to industries we haven't got in South Africa, like
sector, you know, Apple and
IT,
Google
and aeroplanes are the two ones that are often mentioned. So it gives you broader diversification. It also means that if something happens to the South African economy for political or economic reasons, the fund has a protection of having assets diversified. So recognizing that, private sector pension funds are allowed to invest up to 30% of their assets outside South Africa, plus another 10% in Africa. So they could have up to 40%. Typically, most funds that I'm involved with have close to 30% outside of South Africa, plus maybe 2 to 4% in Africa, because Africa is seen as more illiquid and the markets are very small. I mean, South Africa's stock exchange is bigger than the rest of Africa put together, so it's very difficult to get a meaningful exposure. But to answer your question, yes, most funds have close to 30 to 35% of their investments outside of South Africa. The GEPF, I believe, in terms of its policies, can go up to 10%. We do make a point in the report on page 18 to say the fund holds a lower percentage of foreign assets than might otherwise be suggested, purely in terms of the risk diversification of assets.
Then the final question from me is on unlisted investments and private equity and venture capital. I'm sure you know that most funds in the country, they got low weighting in private equity, alternative investments, and I think the PIC has got about 5% there. But if you look globally, they're going for 10%, 15% or so. Do you think GPF and broadly the other funds, you know, ShopRite pension fund, Standard Bank pension fund, should increase that portion, you know, sort of progressively?
Another very good question, Mr. Commissioner. What we are finding is that the global investment markets have moved to a much lower level of return than we got used to. So we had a very fortunate period from 2003 to 2018 where returns often were between 10 and 20% per annum. Going forward, most investment experts don't expect that. So we're looking at much lower nominal returns and real returns going forward. So funds need to find different ways to generate higher returns. And many commentators see venture capital and this investment as a way to do that. Because of their nature, being slightly higher risk, not listed, so there's less exposure to the markets, you expect a higher return. So we are seeing more and more funds looking for other opportunities to generate a higher investment return. How far they go and what percentage of assets is up to each board of trustees.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
If there are no further questions, Mr. Commissioner, that's the evidence.
Is that the evidence?
Yes, and I want to thank the witness for assisting us on very short notice because of other witnesses that could not be available today, and for his assistance in that regard.
What's his name again? Pina. Yes, Mr. Pina. I echo the words, thanking you for being available at short notice, and thank you so much for the evidence that you have given. You will have noticed that I kept quiet. I don't know much about investments because I don't have money. But thank you once again, and please be prepared if we were to ask you to come back to clarify certain aspects. Please do so. Otherwise, you are excused.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Just to clarify, there are no outstanding questions that I need to come back on. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. That's the business for the day. And as discussed yesterday, the Commission will not sit tomorrow. We will resume on Monday at 10 o'clock.
Monday the 27th.
Correct.
Yes. Well, the Commission adjourns until Monday the 27th, I'm sorry, at 10.